want to hit the record button. So last year I asked Liel whether next year he would come back and talk about video games, and a bunch of people said, oh, would he speak? So this year when it came time, I asked him, would you come back? And he said, I'll talk about anything you want. I said, you want to talk about video games, or you want to talk about podcasts? Because I know you do podcasts, and I happen to have a history in podcasts. In fact, before I worked at Ansche Chesed, I worked with Jeremy on a podcast series, which is connects to a podcast that Liel has been doing for the past a year now, right? Are we almost a year into it?
Yeah, year and change.
On the Daily Daf. Jeremy led the Daily Daf Differently, which was the daily podcast last time we went through a round of the Daily Daf, and this year Liel has been studying a daily podcast for Tablet Magazine. So Liel said, "Why don't we talk about podcasts?" And I felt like, especially in this time of quarantine and COVID, as we've all been living in this world, podcasts have actually exploded because we have kind of solo time and more time and different kind of time. And I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation about podcasts, and also to open it up and to ask people what they might have. Anyone has questions about podcasts, and again, I have experience in production of podcasts and creation of podcasts. Liel has a lot of experience in hosting and in the podcast world. And this conversation, if you guys don't have questions, which we hope you will, actually is a conversation that Liel and I have been trying to have since the first parent night at Heschel. When we went around and he introduced himself, and I looked over, I said, "You're the Liel Leibovitz?" He said, I don't know what, and I'm not sure which the Liel Leibovitz mean, but that's me. And I said,
I'm a Liel Leibovitz.
You are a Liel Leibovitz, but he's the Liel Leibovitz that I knew of, because I knew of his Unorthodox podcast. And we said, oh, we should sit down and talk about podcasts. Life got in the way, and we haven't. So if you all don't have questions,
I have a question.
Please.
Okay, so I'm very much forget the word, a little bit of a dinosaur. So what is the difference between, let's say, doing a podcast or recording something and putting it on YouTube?
Excellent question. Darren, you want to take this?
Sure. So a podcast in its most basic form is it is generally, or more likely, audio rather than a video, which would, although there are video podcasts, which is in some way a differentiator from a YouTube video to a podcast. And the technology behind a podcast, which is an RSS feed, a really simple syndication, is what RSS stands for. It through a podcast player, Apple Podcasts, or what used to be iTunes, you subscribe to it once and it'll automatically show up on your machine every day. And so you don't need to go to YouTube to find it, because it will come to you. And that's a big differentiator in terms of creating a loyal fan base or having a series of multiple conversations. Would you describe it differently, Liel?
No, that's perfect. I mean, I will say, first of all, the biggest difference, I'm so happy to be here. I'll say the biggest difference, at least to me, in terms of meaning between our last conversation and this one, is that last time we spoke, I was and my family too, we were fans, we were occasional visitors to Ansche Chesed. Shana, we're members, and it gives me tremendous joy, and I absolutely love this community, and I'm so grateful to you, Darren, and to you, Rabbi Jeremy, for everything. Let me begin kind of like by riffing a little bit, because Sarah, like I come by this completely honestly, unlike my esteemed conversant, who was much smarter about these things, much earlier to these things, much more knowledgeable about these things. I continue to think that podcasts were incredibly stupid and indulgent. When my friend Mark Oppenheimer, who is then the religion columnist of the New York Times, There are no religious columnists at the New York Times, the only religion columnists at the New York Times, called me about 5.5 years ago and said, do you want to do a podcast? And I said, why? And he said, well, because we're Jews and our conversations are really interesting, and maybe we will have news of the Jews, all the things that happened with, Jews that week, and then we'll have a Jewish guest of the week, and then we'll have a Gentile of the week, and the Gentile could ask us questions. And I'm sort of listening. I'll never forget this. It was around 3:30 on a Friday afternoon, just before Shabbos, and I'm sort of rushing to get to Shabbat, and I'm sort of nodding my head and say, yeah, fine, and that sounds like a great idea. And he had mentioned that he had asked another one of our colleagues at Tablet Magazine, where we all work, Stephanie Butnick, to also be a co-host. And so I hang up the phone, and like a mean high school student, I call Stephanie to say, could you believe that Mark is trying to rope us into this idiotic idea? Because why would you listen to this? First of all, one misconception that I had, and I'm so happy to admit my my moral and intellectual failures here. I thought that if you want to be serious about content, you went on the radio, or you wrote for a newspaper, or you went on TV, and the rest of the stuff that was just out there on the internet, on YouTube or via podcast, it was just people blabbering, and so I didn't like that. And second of all, I didn't really know what a Jewish podcast would sound like, but I also didn't know how to not break my friend's heart, because he was clearly very invested in this project. And so I figured I would kill it with kindness. I would say yes, and appear to be enthusiastic, feign a kind of support for this cockamamie endeavor. And then I would wait about 3 or 4 weeks. And then I'd say, listen, buddy, we gave it a shot. It's clearly not working. This is a disaster. I'm really sorry. We're going to have to stop it. And so
5.5 years later, it's the #1 Jewish podcast.
5.5 years later, it gave me one heck of a humbling. But it continued. I want to say 1 or 2 more things, because then something actually really interesting happened. Because our first inclination as we started to do the show was to go real dumb, to be honest, because we thought, what, and you could hear this part of the tragedy of being a podcaster, that these things are archived. You could actually go back and listen to these first episodes, although I beg you, please don't go back and listen to these episodes, because we thought that being a Jewish podcaster, again, lacking Daron's and Rabbi Jeremy's sort of wisdom, we thought that a Jewish podcast would just be cracking a bunch of jokes, and therefore our first episode was about this feud between 2 Jewish dating sites and about Andy Samberg and Adam Sandler. It was really kind of, trifling stuff. And then several miraculous things happened. First of all, people started listening, and the people who are listening are Jews, and this will surprise you, but Jews have opinions, and this will surprise you even more, but they're not ashamed to express these opinions. So they started writing in and saying, here's what I would like you to talk about. And we could immediately see that the things that they cared about were actually really, really, really deep. And Daron, I hope we could talk about this a little bit, but part of the things that we sort of realized is that for a lot of these people, not having the benefit of a tremendous community like Ansche Chesed, podcasts and eventually our podcast became a place to really form a community and really ask questions about Jewish identity and what it means to be Jewish, and really try to kind of forge this way of faith, of belief, of belonging. And it was amazing. And as soon as we realized that the responsibility that we had was actually really, really great. And moreover, that the privilege we had was tremendous. And then we got serious.
It was interesting because I actually think that I think that I listened to your podcast early on, and thought it was, again, I listened to a lot of podcasts. And then as we got to know each other in the more recent years, I listened back again and thought it was a much better podcast.
For sure.
Like you were I thought you were just being a little too silly early on. And I think it's interesting that, like I thought either maturity or maybe I just heard it in a different way, but really felt like, the way you guys spoke about the topics you spoke about, you took it more seriously and you took the audience seriously.
I agree wholeheartedly. I would say it's a result of two things. You know, the first is something that I talked about, which is really understanding the kind of the extent really of the mission. You know, if you think about how many things have changed about American Jewish life in the last 40, 50, 60 years, if you think about how much more tremendously, wonderfully diverse the American Jewish experience is, how many more ways there are of being Jewish, how many more families that are blended, how many more, you know, expressions of sexual identity or political orientation or what have you. There are in ways that still want to engage seriously with Judaism and still want to include and rightfully see all parts of their identity as part of one big mosaic. That is something that institutional life, I think, has been understandably slow to address. And podcasts emerge as this medium in which you could have the sort of frank conversations, immediate conversations, timely conversations, honest conversations that you're unlikely for a whole host of reasons, some of them organizational, some of them emotional, some of them political, to hear in many, many shuls. If you even go to shul, which sadly is not the overwhelming majority of people. The second thing that really took us time, and this is something that I really want to hear your thoughts on, because the other thing that I understood about podcasting that makes it so different than other media, it is an extraordinarily intimate medium. You listen to the radio and maybe you're in a car, maybe you're doing something, but it's still kind of the radio. You listen to a podcast, it's coming through your phone that's always in your pocket. And most likely you're cutting vegetables or cooking dinner or walking the dog or walking to work. You're at the time where you're most yourself, because you're most vulnerable, because you're most kind of, you know, sort of in your own little weird headspace. And this voice comes in your ear and this voice begins to feel like a friend. And one of the really weird things that started happening, and it's incredible to me and like the greatest gift, is that people started writing letters, and about 1 every 3 of these letters would say, I've never written a letter to a quote unquote public figure before, but I feel like you guys are friends, you know? And I think that's true. Like, I would never feel that a person on TV is someone that I knew. I would never feel that a writer, even people who I read, you know, daily for years, are people who I know intimately. But with the podcast host, I sometimes go, you know, 3-4 episodes, be like, this person's my friend. I should write them a note and tell them about something that I thought about. And to learn how to do this, to learn, in other words, that you're not affecting some kind of, well, welcome, this is National Public Radio. Silence, silence, silence. But rather talking, just being present, just being here now, to quote a great Jewish sage. That took a long time.
I think it's really interesting. I think on some level, I'd like to say that podcast is just radio on demand in the way that DVR is television on demand, but it's not, because of the intimacy.
Say more. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. So if you had to kind of look at the emotional gestalt of radio versus podcasting and sort of opine about how one is, you know, one runs deeper than the other, what would you say? I've thought about this a lot. I don't really have a coherent thought.
Look, I mean, I think it's a fine line, because Rachel Maddow was the first MSNBC star to have a podcast because she had worked for Air America Radio, and when she transferred, and they did a podcast of that show, and when she transferred over, they allowed her contract to continue to have that show. So that's the unusual side, right? That's the large media conglomerate podcasts versus. I think because podcasts came out of niche, podcasts were born, I believe, from the 2 main podcast areas when podcasts began 13, 14 years ago was technology, so geeks, right? People who were interested in the newest technology, and the television show Lost. There were more podcasts about the television show Lost, which had a deep fandom. So it was people who all believed the same thing, or wanted to fight about who, whether the Dharma initiative was good or bad,
Right.
but it was all a very small, dedicated group, right? And the people who were interested in how many cores your computer had or whatever was a very intimate, small group. It was using a technology that didn't know, and therefore everyone felt connected. And so its birth, right, was based on that space. Podcasts then really became a something with Serial, right? But even that was a very intimate story, right? It was very intimate, and she told it in an unbelievably intimate way, but everyone felt that connection.
You guys, Darone, if I can
Please.
jump in for 1 second. There's somebody on the call who I think has really something to contribute to this conversation, which is really interesting about the intimacy of the medium and the differences or similarities with radio. And that's somebody who had a longtime radio show on WBAI, which I have never heard it, certainly before my time chronologically, but people who have talked to me about it also described Fred Hershkowitz's shows on the radio as being intimate, and his call-in shows. Fred, do you have anything you'd like to add about all this conversation?
Yeah, there's two kinds of radio. There's recorded radio and there's live radio. Podcasts are always recorded. So when you talk about intimacy, what could be more intimate than being in bed late at night or early in the morning and listening to someone live on the radio who makes mistakes, who can't be edited, your podcasts are edited, who doesn't quite know what's coming up, right? Who takes phone calls, right? It's a very different, you talk about intimacy, that's intimate, right? So I just want you to know, when you say, radio's this, radio's that, you have to divide it between live radio and recorded radio. There's less and less live radio now. And
But tell us a little bit about your show, when you did it and what its format was.
It was a variety show. It was on from 6 to 9, sometimes 6 to 10, just once a week on WBAI. And yes, it was 25 years. And I used lots of formats. I used music. I used recordings. I mean, this is going back, it started in 1983. So I used LPs. I used comedy, music, sound effects. I took phone calls. And I moved from one topic to the next. And I had music often was the way it separated topics. I brought people on live, authors, sometimes athletes, sometimes people that were involved politically. But it was all live. That's the thing I want you to remember. Very different than something that can be. I did a lot of stuff. I worked for NYC for a long time too, in the news department, and there I had to edit tape. I gave in a piece of tape to the news department.
Fred,
So,
can I ask you who are your radio heroes? Who did you grow up idolizing?
well, that's easy. That's easy. People probably know the answer. For me, it was Gene Shepard. I thought it was wonderful. I thought it was incredible. In the 50s and in the 60s, pretty much, there was lots of live radio in the morning, a lot of live radio all through New York City. It's funny the way it was set up. Some of it was left over from the 40s, where a couple would have breakfast and you'd hear them live over the radio having breakfast and talking to each other. That's something that came out of the 40s, but that leaked into the 50s. But Bob and Ray, I used to hear in the 50s as a kid. That was live. Clavin and Finch. Bob and Ray, you'll probably know, not Clavin and Finch. But everything was live. Everything was live. I mean, TV was live in the 50s too. So, I mean, I'm going way back. I'm not saying I want to go back to those days, but there's less and less live radio. And it seems to be, I guess, the 24-hour sports stations, if you hear them in New York City, at WFAN and ESPN, 24 hours live. And then you have, like, let's go to the AM band. You have ABC, which is all right wing. That's political radio station. That's live. They're on tape delay when they take phone calls, I'm sure. All those shows are. But anyway, it's back to Jeremy's question. I loved live radio. I really did. It was precious, and I loved listening to it. And again, for intimacy, lying in bed with the lights off late at night, listening to live radio, or even in the morning a little bit, that's very intimate.
So let me, I'm sorry not to put you on the spot, but it's Rabbi Jeremy's fault. He's the one who did it. So
It's
don't
always
blame me.
Rabbi Jeremy's fault.
Of course. It's always the rabbi's
That's
fault.
why we hired him. He doesn't even know that yet. It took him all 20.
Literally, that's the definition of Judaism. It's always the rabbi's fault.
It
Let
took
me
him
ask you this.
21 years to figure this out.
Do you think that the ascent of podcasting as a medium has to do in part because that kind of, and I totally agree with you, kind of absolutely charged, incredible energy of live radio began to dissipate as less and less and less and radio was live, therefore kind of creating the space for a sort of, sister medium or daughter medium to come in and sort of claim that the mantle of this intimacy?
Once more?
Do you think that podcasts became a big thing because radio began sort of betraying its commitment to sort of live energy?
I think radio stopped growing. It just became a bunch of talking heads. And I think the content and the people doing it, look at the people doing live radio. I mean, it's hard to find stuff now. The AM band is WO in New York, WOR, ABC. These are difficult people to listen to. They're angry, right-wing people. There's that guy on that's curing cancer all over the place on the AM band. There are religious stations on, not particularly Jewish, but there's a couple of religious stations. As you go up and up to the dial, you have Asian stations, one after the other on the AM band, ending with where Rachel Maddow worked, Air America. What was his name? Mark, what's his name? He ran
Maron? Mark Maron?
No. He ran for mayor. What was his name? He owned
Mark Green.
America.
Mark Green.
Exactly. Yeah. So the other thing is you have to deal with before the internet. Look what radio was. You had to be within that band. I mean, that was the intimacy. If you were in that band, right? You had, that was you talk about family or something. That was your tribe. That was your group. That was your clan. The band defined you because people beyond that band couldn't hear you. So BAI was amazing. Got at 50,000 watts. It had 40 million people in a radius from the Empire State Building. A lot of radio stations have 5,000 watt bands. They have, 10, 12, 14 miles. So podcasts are very wild because you take it with you wherever you go. You stick it in your pocket. You say it's intimate, but most of the people I know, including both my daughters, listen to the podcast as they walk down the streets. That could not be intimate. I'm not saying it's bad or good, the content. I'm saying where you listen to it determines a lot about how you feel about it. I listen to a podcast because the pandemic, a friend of mine does a podcast. She interviews people in the non-for-profit world. That's her podcast. I listen at home because I'm home all the time. But if I was swinging my arms walking down Broadway, it'd be a very different kind of listening. So just imagine the exact same thing she says. I'm listening at home with a cup of coffee, or I'm on the train or a bus or walking down the street. Very different. I want to say one funny thing I did. Jeremy's going to love this. I got a friend of mine once, about 1984 or 5. We decided we'd help people get dressed in the morning, depending on what they had to do. Live radio. So we asked people to call in and tell us on WBAI what were they going for a job interview? Were they going to a funeral? Were they going to work? And they called in and we helped them pick their clothing. They went over to their closet and it was so much fun. Another show I did, I asked people, they had no idea this was coming up, right? To dump out their purses and empty their wallets and tell me what was in them. And that was, it was sort of a fun thing, I did a very sophisticated show, I must say, because the music that I played and the comedy and the sound effects all related to what I was saying, You remember those?
Brett, thanks so much for bringing in your experience from your own very interesting.
You gonna stop me now? I can't believe it.
Fred, we'll need to find an evening where you can just tell your stories.
Well, that's
or have a podcast.
Exactly.
Thank you, sir. No, it's great hearing you guys. Go ahead, continue. I'm sorry.
I like this idea of maybe we should get a new app that basically just uses geotags to do regional podcasts where you could only listen if you're actually in the same town as the podcaster.
Well, I think one of the guys from the Cultural Gabfest is actually just created CityCasts, which is it's not only to listen, it's not only for people in the city to listen to. I mean, obviously you can listen to a CityCast in Chicago if you're in New York, but it's based on the idea of a more a local,
hyper-local.
You know,
Yeah, Fred, that's a great point about the ban. Like that's very true.
right. I mean, I think the answer, a piece of the answer to the question that you asked is why do you think podcasts have taken off is just changing technology. You know, I mean, technology changed to make it easier. New York City people could never listen to the radio because we were underground.
Yeah.
You know,
I just want to chime in on one thing about the difference of podcasts and radio, which I find it fascinating because I had never really thought about the difference before, because I have radio programs I listen to as podcasts, like they are sort of interchangeable. But I do think the portability component of everything in our life right now has been the biggest change. And I think that's what brings the intimacy in. And there's a different intimacy, frankly, in hearing spoken word, be it on radio or a podcast, than reading, let's say, a newspaper or a magazine. You know, oral is how we just interact in a very informal way. And there's a sense that whether it is recorded or not, and whether it is edited or not, there's a sense that it somehow feels more spontaneous than we speak, even if it really is scripted in the end. But I think that because of the transmission is orally, we take it in differently because it's just such a familiar medium of communication to all of us.
For sure. And I don't know if how many people here are familiar, and Mr. Lewis, we'll get to your question in a second. With this new application called Clubhouse, which I have become completely and utterly obsessed with. It is basically a social network in which you plug in and people start chat rooms, basically like those phone party lines that were popular in New York in the 80s and the 90s. And you can just start your own room and start talking about whatever you want, and it's live and it's not recorded, and you can invite whoever you want to join. And I just find it to be a delight. For one thing, it has happened to me several times in which people would start talking and say, well, you know, Elon Musk doesn't believe so and so and so. And then all of a sudden you'll hear a ping and Elon Musk will come in and be like, actually, no, I do. It's that new and that small and that wild that these things happen. But also, Bonnie, is exactly what you said. It's this kind of notion that the conversation is still so intimate, and it's the portability probably helps. Mr. Lewis, you asked how does one start a podcast, and I think Mr. Ruskay here is a much better authority on the
I wanted to just check, Sheldon, on whether the question was how do you launch, as in publish a new podcast, or how do you listen to a podcast? Like, just because
how do you start one? I've been a guest on one, which is on a platform, and that's the end of what I know about podcasts.
The world has made the world has made podcasting quite easy to launch. It's the hardest thing is actually to stick with it, because there are programs like Anchor where you just hit a button, say start my podcast, speak into the Anchor app, which is on your phone, and it will do everything else. And I, know some people who started a podcast on Anchor, and it's quite big and quite wonderful. And now the Anchor has they've gotten big enough that they've actually gotten some advertising through Anchor. The majority of people who are doing it on Anchor are they don't stick with it. Whenever people come to me and ask me, oh, I'd like to start a podcast, my first question is, okay, give me the title and the content for your first 12 episodes. 12 episodes, that's a lot. And I say, well, a podcast is a lot. Even if you only do one a month, you need to have, are you going to do this long term? Because you don't get an audience quickly. It takes a long time to get an audience. And so you need to have content even when no one's listening and you still have content. How do you make a podcast? What you really could do is record your audio. You record your audio on whatever you want to use to record, and you can do as little as put it up on SoundCloud, which is a audio aggregating website. You create a free or paid app there, a free or paid account there, and when you do that and you create something on SoundCloud, they'll say, do you want your RSS feed? Your RSS feed is what your podcast is. It's got, and you say yes, and they'll give it to you, and you go over to iTunes, you go over to Apple, and you submit that RSS feed to Apple, and in 24 hours in 72 hours you have a podcast. That is the easiest, simplest answer. If you want to do your podcast well, and you're planning on sticking with it, there's a lot more to it, and we could get into that.
I'd like to riff on this and also use that as a kind of opportunity to answer the other question we just received.
Yeah.
The late tzaddik Christopher Hitchens, I only call him that because he would have hated it, said that writing well is just as easy as speaking well. But when you think about it, how many of us could actually do that? The first kind of notion that I get is from people who've never thought about this, and I'm sure Fred has similar experiences. Like, oh, you just talk. Like, how hard is that? Anyone can talk, until there's one of these in front of you, and you realize that you have to fill, as Dan said, many hours of content, and then you sort of go a little bit frozen. Just to give you some fun with numbers, there are approximately 1.3 million podcasts out there in the world today. Just for fun, if you want to be in the top 10% of all podcasts in the world, how many listeners do you need per episode? Out of 1.3 million podcasts, how many listeners do you need?
Millions.
The correct answer is 3,000.
Wow.
If you want to be in the top 5%, it's something like 5,000, which teaches you that the majority of these shows, the overwhelming majority, can't even get, as many people as it would take to fill, 2 city blocks in New York, which says a lot. It is both what is terrifying about podcasting and what is so wonderful about podcasting, because personally, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a second, my taste in listening to podcasts tends almost completely towards the utterly bizarre and idiosyncratic, because I share Fred's kind of sentiment that the fun thing is to have something that is close as could be to just a person talking, as live as it could get without being really live. And so that is, I think, the biggest problem is basically understanding that this medium isn't just, oh, I'm going to talk about this because it's this. And I think that when you look at the people who do this very well, you understand that they actually understand this medium. They understand how to tell stories. They understand how to structure episodes. They understand how to use, sophisticated, as Fred said, sophisticated music and bits. They understand how to interview guests. They understand how structure works. I'm going to give a shout out right now. My friend, is also a very incestuous world, so a bunch of these people are friends. My friend Noreen Malone just launched the 3rd season of the show Slow Burn, which looks at one kind of historical event. The new season is about the Iraq War, which is fantastic. The way the story is structured is just marvelous. I want to take two quick questions that come here. First one from Sarah, like, how long is each episode? The question is impossible to answer. The Daf Yomi podcast that I do, that's 6 minutes every morning. It's a bite-sized, short little thing. On Unorthodox, sometimes we go 40 minutes, sometimes we go an hour and a half. And we've done all sorts of metrics to see what people prefer here, there, and everywhere. And I can't actually have any sort of definitive answer. It really depends on, how good is the stuff? If it's great, I will listen, and compelling, I would listen for as long as it takes.
I've always said when for a single person podcast, your goal is 24 minutes. Why 24 minutes? 24 minutes is the national average time a person spends commuting, in their car commuting in America, and the average amount of time a person spends on a machine at the gym. And so I feel
or if you're like me, an average amount of time a person spends on a machine at the gym every year.
It's Willie Mays' number in baseball. It's Willie Mays' number.
and
Very
that's another
important.
good reason.
Very important.
It's an auspicious number. So I want to take another question we had about how these wonderful creations make money. Again, I think Darren have a lot more wisdom here. Our understanding, and we just launched a podcasting network, a tablet. So this is a question I'm thinking about a lot, is that you basically have several ways to do it. First of all, companies now are beginning subscription services and toying with the subscription model, including some very large companies like Apple, Spotify. That is certainly a time-honored way, charge people for the product, right? Advertising is another. We find that once you cross those numbers that we discussed into the 5,000 listeners an episode, and then 10, and then 20, and then 50, and then 100, you start making not, a tremendous amount of money, but enough money to more than cover your production budget and then some. And then the third way that I think is very, very helpful is basically, well, there's one more way which some podcasts are doing very popularly, which is crowdfunding, basically saying, we'll start a service, we'll start some kind of page on crowdfunding sites like Patreon, and we'll say people who sign up and give us, say, $5 a month will have exclusive access to another episode or a few more minutes per show or something like that, that's only for supporters. And some podcasts are very successful in that. And then there's the model that I love best, because it brings us back again to what Fred was talking about before, which is live events. It is shocking, because you would not think that going out to see a bunch of people sitting on a stage and talking is anyone's idea of a good time. And yet in Unorthodox, we find that we are very fortunate to have many invitations to go and record the show live. In part, it gives people the thrill of seeing this actually done in real time. In part, because they feel that they know us. It's nice to kind of congregate together. We put out this book called The Newish Jewish Encyclopedia, and went on a 60-something city book tour for the past year and a half, in person and then virtually when COVID struck, and that's a very lovely way to grow an audience. I think the proper way to actually sort of shake hands and have beers and really get to know each other, which is really why we're doing this to begin with.
Do other people have questions? All right. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to read. If you're a writer looking to get published, one of the things the agent wants to know about you is what's your platform? How many people do you communicate with? People with large platforms are somewhat more likely to get published than those who don't. All other things being equal, if you have 5,000 fans, you're likely to sell out your first run. Twisted Sisters JJ French, with a podcast consisting of many of Twisted Sisters fans, and his book telling about how he found success, found a willing publisher without much difficulty. Of course, JJ has a huge fan base to begin with. And he was a great boss at a pool hall that I used to work at. Yeah, I think that's completely true, Jeff. A loyal audience.
You know that JJ French is Jeff's brother, right? You knew that?
I do know that. I do.
Rock on.
Which makes Jeff the twisted brother.
But yeah, I mean, Jeff, I will say, look, I for my sins also dabble in writing books. I've published some, and this definitely makes a difference, because the word platform could sound really icky, because it sounds like you're out there and you're marketing something and you're sort of like a fishmonger, right? But I think that because the medium works the way it works, the interest is actually sort of genuine. And when you start talking about it and it's so much part of you, you don't just sell the book, you talk about the process, So for example, I will not talk about myself, but I will plug my friend Mark Oppenheimer's book. He has an amazing book coming out in October about the Squirrel Hill shooting. And he spent a year and a half in Pittsburgh meeting with, survivors and families of the victims and law enforcement, really writing what I know is going to be the definitive book about this incident for many, many years to come. And as he was writing this book, he actually talked about the process, all the time. Sort of, I'm in Pittsburgh, I met this great person, and shared, a few of the anecdotes. And so when the book comes out, it's not going to feel to our listeners like we're just talking a product, like buy our vitamin supplements, like, Alex Jones on his show. It's going to feel like something that they were a part of, that they really sort of grew up sort of hearing about and spent like 2 years now, kind of thinking of. So I like that.
Do you think the Jewish Encyclopedia could have come had the podcast not existed?
No, never.
Never.
No. I mean, it could have come, but the sensibility would have been the sensibility of the book is so much the sensibility of the podcast, and its success in finding an audience is so deeply predicated on this. And look, we see it in our own careers. I think Mark and I are both fortunate to have sort of long-standing relationships with publishers and agents and really kind of be in this field before we became podcasters. So it wasn't like we were sort of banging on doors, begging to get in before. But the doors have gotten a bit more open, and people have gotten a bit more receptive. Again, because it's this rarest thing. It actually feels organic. I'm not like standing there in a street corner ringing the bell. I'm talking about something that I care about just as deeply when I'm not selling something with people who feel themselves, and I'm proud of that feeling, to be sort of emotionally intimates of mine, and I love that. We have another question about the costs involved. If you could do it on your iPhone, Ellen asks, via Anchor, and I assume putting something on SoundCloud is free. Do you need editing software? I will go very brief because Darone Ruskay here is absolutely the Pope of these things, to use a very Jewish metaphor. I would say that if you asked me, even 3 years ago, I'd say, yeah, sure, just talking to your iPhone, I'll be fine. As you could tell by this very expensive microphone I'm talking into, I have sort of come around to appreciating the tremendous difference that things from having the proper audio equipment, which doesn't cost, tens of thousands of dollars, but costs a little, to actually having the shows edited properly, which again, editing software itself isn't expensive, but a person who really knows how to use editing software and is really an audio editor, that's really rare. As Fred said before, to know how to kind of match the right sound at the right moment, and kind of, because it is so much, to me, an editor's medium, that's really important. And so kind of good news and bad news. Bad news is that I think production costs are definitely rising. People are definitely investing much more in sound design, equipment, editors, etc. Good news is, if you look at video and what it costs, videos here, we're like all the way at the bubble. I mean, I think you could get, I'm going to be very crass here, but I think that for a few $100s a week, you could get a crackerjack editor to really make a world of a difference. And I don't want to move it around because it's set up very nicely. I have probably the top of the line setup that you could get without, really losing your mind. That setup is $1,700. I mean, it's not $17,000 or $170,000. So we're still very much within the realms of the same. Darren, am I more or less?
I think that's completely right. I think what's actually interesting is, and I've been in the podcast game for a long time, and I think that things have professionalized as things have gotten bigger, in a big way. And I think that people who listen to podcasts are usually there is a level of, okay, I'll accept a little bit of noise, but less so than it used to be. although what Fred talked about is that is the intimacy that comes from live radio. There can be overproduction as well. And an if and a moment of silence is actually an important thing because there's something natural and human about it. But yes, in terms of technology, what you need to put out for the machinery, couple. I mean, I think you could do well for less than $1,700. But yes, you're doing better if you spend a little money because sound is better. It's the cost is not the software. The cost is the person who knows how to use the software.
And the more I'm in this field, by the way, just as an aside, I don't know how many of you know this. This is something that never ceases to give me joy. A lot of people listen to podcasts on either double speed or 1.5 times speed because they just want to get through more content, which is amazing and terrifying and something that I have never done and will never do. But my greatest sense of professional pride in this thing is that when people say, you guys are Jews, you talk so fast, I can't even listen to you on 1.5 time. I have to listen in real time because you just talk fast. The more I'm kind of in this in this game, the more I realize what an absolute gift a tremendous audio editor is, and what an amazing difference they make. You know, I've now had, as we were sort of expanding this network, we have the very good fortune of working with a tremendously talented editor, and so I was completely spoiled.
Well, his name sounds like he used to work in the Trump organization, Scaramucci, right? Isn't it?
Oh yeah, we call him the Mooch to annoy him. He's a young kid. No, and also our sort of chief producer Josh Cross, and you know, I thought everyone was as good as this, and then we had more shows to produce, and so we went out and hired a bunch more people, and then I heard the outcome was like, that sounds completely wrong. Even just like the wrong song or the right song coming in a half a second too late, just like kills everything. It is such an incredible, I mean, and it's so hard to capture. So I'll give you an anecdote. We're working on a show now that I am like wildly enthusiastic about. It's an 8-part radio documentary about Father Charles Coughlin, the sort of, you know, firebrand anti-Semitic priest from the 30s, who was, you know, big fan of Hitler and a sort of stone's throw away from the White House himself. So in other words, a story about a dangerous, hateful demagogue who, using a new medium, gets way too close to political power. So total fiction, something that can never happen in our time. It's total, you know, distant history. And working this story, as you know, it requires using a lot of archival material from Father Coughlin, using a lot of interviews, a lot of, you know, sort of audio bits from the 30s and the 40s, a lot of music to set up the mood, and just putting that together really drove home the point to me as you could just have just a little bit of an emotional turn of the dial here or there, puts you in such a radically different mindset. It is such, I mean, look, there is a reason why when you're really depressed, when you're having a terrible day, when things are not going your way, you don't go home and read your favorite book. You don't go to the museum and look at your favorite sculpture. You go home and you put on the record you love, right? There's a reason why Bet HaMikdash had musicians. Yeah, there were people there to elevate the spirit. This is a deeply spiritual medium, and it puts you in this tremendous mood. And therefore, the people who do it, yes, they need to be super good technologists and need to work all these pieces of software. But really, it comes down to orchestrating and manufacturing that kind of feeling and getting that cadence right and getting you really into this groove. And I'm just in awe. I could do it okay, I think, but I'm really in awe of people who could do it tremendously well.
We had teased earlier, and you had mentioned you would. What are your favorite podcasts? What are you listening to?
All right, promotion time. I want to start by talking about, hands down, my absolute favorite new podcast. I am in love with one of the hosts, really in love, you know, enough to marry her and have 2 children with her. My wife Lisa has a new show on Tablets Network called Anxiously, in which she and her friend Amy, two by their own definition anxious Jewesses, look at the things that sort of give them agita, and look at anxiety as the kind of baseline feeling that so many of us have. And every week welcome another guest to help them kind of get to the bottom of why it is that they're feeling the way they're feeling about anything from touching raw chicken, which makes them anxious, to dealing with grief in the time of COVID. So the conversations sometimes are light and airy and wonderful, and sometimes are very, very deep. For the grief conversation, for example, they sat with this unbelievable imam and have a conversation about grieving mourning traditions in Judaism and Islam, and it was just this great, beautiful conversation that I love. I mentioned Noreen Malone's Slow Burn, the third season. I've only heard 2 episodes, but it is, I loved the first 2 seasons too, which were great. Watergate and Clinton, they were fantastic. But this one, I don't know, maybe because the Iraq War is more vivid in my own memory and kind of my own political lifetime. The show is really, really tremendously delightful. I really love another podcast, even though politically we don't always align, but my friend Nagin Farsad has a show called Fake the Nation, which is a very political podcast and very, very funny. I was on it a few times as the sort of, the white guy with the beard slot. And it is, if you like the sort of, the feeling of the old timey Daily Show, like really biting political satire that feels freewheeling and cool. That's a great show. And then there are a whole host of really, really, really weird shows that I listen to. I love the BBC's In Our Time. It is hosted by this eminence Greece named Melvin Bragg, who every week brings 4 or 3 or several academics to talk about topics like, the Treaty of Versailles, William the Conqueror. And you would think it is the most boring premise imaginable, but the editing and also the level of interviewing and questioning is so fascinating. It makes it come alive. And then I always love to troll the internet for absolute bizarre things, because I think this is one thing that podcasting does very well. I'll give one example that I don't think anyone in particular will enjoy, but I do. It's this show called Dogman Encounters. It is predicated on the following premise. The premise is that the US government created a secret breed of super soldiers, which are half people, half canine. And somehow they escaped and they've been let loose. And you hear it once, you're like, ha ha ha, this is probably a joke or someone is crazy, until you realize that the show has been going on for about, I think, 7 or 8 years now. They have hundreds of episodes and the production is intensely good for what it is. It all sounds super conspiratorial, and you kind of feel like you are in a very different world. It's like Orson Welles' War of the Worlds come to life over a decade, and so I love podcasts that do this, that really put you in this mood where you feel like, is this real? Am I really listening to this, or is this someone's idea of a prank? So yeah, I like to keep my diet very varied. But now I'm about to learn and have a few more new favorite podcasts, because Darren, you're going to tell me yours.
Well, as a lifelong Mets fan, and I'm surprised you didn't mention any Mets podcasts.
Oh, we don't talk about painful things in public
after last night. But so you have to watch, listen to some of those shows. And anytime I get to listen to Keith once a week, it's a great show. Interestingly, I must say, and it sounds like I'm just right. I got, as we were preparing to do this program, I said, I had not listened in a while to Unorthodox, and I wanted to listen again before we actually did the show, and have found it, again, as I said, I felt like it changed in energy. I'm really like, it's one of my go-tos every week. I'm really loving it. I again loved last week's episode with the author of the Mets book, which all circles back there. In fact, now my entire family, including both boys and me, and my father, are all reading the book. But I'm also a fan of of kind of the Gab Fest, the Slate world of podcasts, the very kind of staid kind of grandma of podcasts at this point. The cultural Gab Fest, the political Gab Fest. I'm always nipping at your tail in the Jewish of Unorthodox in the Jewish podcast field. I don't ever miss the Promised podcast with Noah Ephron, a kind of a lefty Israeli podcast on Israel politics and culture, and I find that to be a show that kind of speaks to me. And again, as you were saying, he really is committed to creating community in his podcasts, and I've gotten to know him through the podcast on a very personal level, and we've connected in that way. And I think that's one of the strengths of that show is that relationship that I feel like I have with him, and that actually have had because of him. So I think that's a really powerful show. And then you always find, there's the show you listen to for a few weeks, and the Sporkful. So it's a show about not about foodies, it's eaters. It's and he just invented his own new pasta shape. He did a 6-episode thing where he made a pasta shape that is now being sold, and you cannot buy it. It went out of, it's like, he can't get enough flour. And it's just fascinating the hole you could go into to follow podcasts.
Right. But also, I mean, to sort of connect to this, and again, you and Rabbi Jeremy were far wiser, far earlier on. But so one thing that really amazed me, I'll tell you this origin story. So the last Siyum Hashas, when we finished reading the cycle of Talmud, was on a Sunday, right? It was in MetLife Stadium, tens of thousands of people, and I've always kind of wanted to do this. And so on literally Thursday, 3 days before this thing ends, I'm like, I think we need a podcast. I think we need a daily Daf Yomi Talmud podcast. And I called my dear friend Alana Newhouse, who's the editor-in-chief of Tablet, and said, so I want to launch a new show on Monday that needs to run for 7.5 years. Like, how's that for job security? Like, now you can't fire me until we finish reading the entire Talmud. It's like Shahrazada and 1001 Nights. And sort of jumped into it, having absolutely no idea what a Daf Yomi podcast would sound like, and more importantly, who would come to this. My assessment very early on is that this was a show for a few hundred people who cared about Talmud, and that'll be the extent of that, and it'll be good. And we started inviting people into this conversation, and I was absolutely floored, completely blown away by how many people are tuning into this thing. And I wish I could claim any particular credit here. I wish I could say like, oh, that's because we're so amazing at what we do. But I think it's this notion, podcasting now being what it is, the opportunity to connect to something like Talmud, even to something like Talmud, which is so intricate, which is so involved, which is so demanding, and do it in this way that is totally emotionally and intellectually open, that is sort of bite-sized, that is available, is just magical. And it's inviting whole new audiences that otherwise would never ever plug into this. And that's the thing that gives me so much hope in this field, because I think, look, a lot of things, and Darren and I have been talking about this, a lot of things, including bad things, might happen to podcasting. We see corporate America moving in. That is very rarely a sign of anything good about to happen to anyone. We see a lot of politicization. We see a lot of all the things that destroyed, all the other media that we love. But at the same time, this is still the medium where you could say, you know what I'm going to do with my life? I am going to do a show every day about the Talmud and invite Congresswoman Katie Porter and, NBA star Enos Cantor and like all kinds of weird and wonderful people to read a page of Talmud with me and just relate to the ancient timeless wisdom of the book. And you could still do that. and that I think moves people from the podcasting realm to a deeper sense of connection. I don't think it stops there. I think it really continues to grow.
I think that's right on. One person did ask. I just want to answer this one question. I think we should, ask some other questions, and we should let the evening go. But one asked, they said, you mentioned the tablet network. What and where is that, and how does it relate to podcasts?
So tablet, we started, we had a podcast called Vox Tablet, and then we started Unorthodox, again, not really thinking that it would do well, and then it did well. And then we started another podcast, about the weekly parsha. We started the Daf Yomi podcast, and next thing you know, as the saying goes, $1 million here, $1 million there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. We realized we had, a bunch of shows and also a love for the medium, and also some proven track record of producing things that people liked. And so we got a generous grant to start Tablet Studios and produce all sorts of new shows. Anxiously, by my wife that I mentioned before is one of them. Hebrew School, which is a really kind of nice game show for kids that reimagines the idea of, Hebrew school.
We had an Ansche Chesed member on last season.
That's correct. Yeah.
Who was on?
It's Elizabeth
Harris.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And that is another show. It's coming back for a second season, although with much better hosts this time around, because last time it was myself, and now we actually hired professionals who know how to do this work with kids as educators in a much more kind of dynamic and cool way. We're putting out the Father Coughlin show, which we're tremendously excited about. We're working on a show about Jews in sports, which is our obsession, of course. So all kinds of shows that really are opportunities to explore the ways we live now. And we try to keep the offerings supremely diverse. Some of the shows go, right to the core of Jewish text and tradition. Some are more sort of cultural, some are weekly talk shows, some are more produced kind of mini series, if you will. Still very early stages, but man, am I loving my job these days.
Look, the idea is with over 1.5 million podcasts to choose from, a network allows you to say, oh, I like this one, what's on the bottom of your Amazon page. It's the same reason that when I created JCast, is the bottom of your Amazon page. If you like this episode, you'll like this, you may well like this one, rather than having to randomly find it
right.
amongst the 1.5 million.
And to the question of where to find it, tabletmag.com/podcasts is where you would find all these wonderful shows. Also, to the question of the economics, we find that selling ads and also kind of streamlining production budgets, it gets easier and more feasible if you could offer different shows that cater to different audiences, but also have a core listenership at the heart of them. And you could use existing shows to promote others.
You guys, that is awesome. Thank you very, very much for a really stimulating evening and sharing your own expertise and your obvious enthusiasm and love. And I think we all have lots of stuff that we can enjoy and listen to and go looking for. So I'm very grateful for you guys, grateful for all the people who came, and thank you very, very much. And wish everybody tonight we will, as long as I'm here. Let us count our way down to Shavuot, as long as we're here.
Baruch Hashem.
And yesterday was a disgraced former Buffalo Bill who allegedly maybe did a violent act, and today will be Tony Dorsett, or who else wore this number somewhere between 32 and 34, today being the beginning of Lag BaOmer. Who else? Patrick Ewing.
Sandy Koufax was 32.
Sandy Koufax was yesterday, though. Today is going to be Patrick Ewing. It's going to be Tony Dorsett, and I'm sure we can come up with some other ones if we think hard enough.
Right.
And we'll say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu asferet ha'omer.
Amen.
Yom Shlosha Yamim 30 Yom Shehem 4 שבועות ו5 ימים לעומר.
Man. Thank you.
All right, everybody.
Right, everyone should go and to Ansche Chesed tribute.com, to me, anshechesed.org/tribute, and consider joining us on May 25th
Or 20.
May 23rd. And
All right.
Will it be a podcast?
It'll be a Zoom call.
the Ask Real Nice. Thank you.
Nice.
Hallelujah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Liel.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Liel.
everyone.
Hey, David. Hey, Roberta.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Fred.